Hey guys, it's me. Um, I did not come back to school like I planned, as I'm sure you have heard by now. I had some unexpected surgery um, on Sunday, I guess. Um, yeah, everything went fine, um, but I don't have an appendix anymore. So they told me to take this week off, which I don't really have much of an argument to make because I'm missing some organs that I had last week. Um, but everything's fine, just home and recovering and in pain, and that's about it. So this one is not going to be nearly as long as the last one, which I'm sure you will appreciate. But then by the same token, there's a ton of stuff to talk about from the last section of reading. So please forgive me. As you might guess, I have not nearly as prepared to do this video as I was the last one because I've been a little busy the last few days. So it's not going to be quite as crisp and clean as the last one, but we'll make our way through it and we'll be able to have some sort of a discussion about all the major things that happened in this section of the book. So with that being said, when we pick things up, people at school are wondering about Christopher's fight with his dad. There obviously is some suspicion that there's been some abuse, but nobody seems to want to push the issue too much. Christopher gets home and he is looking for the book, but he doesn't find it in the trash basket, which is where his dad threw it. And that is significant because it means that his dad took it out of the trash bin. So there must have been some value that Ed saw in the book that he hadn't clearly communicated to Christopher, because otherwise it would still be in the trash. So for some reason, Ed took it out, and he decided that it was important to keep it upstairs in his room. The fight does not seem to have bothered Christopher as far as his investigation goes. He is still trying to get the answers to his questions, and it's actually maybe even emboldened him, made him more bold, because now he's willing to violate Ed's trust by going into his room and going through his things, which is a pretty gross violation of the things that Christopher says that he stands for. So it's pretty important that he does that he snoops around. So then we see the envelopes, um, which you now know are pretty significant. But even then, they're a suggestion that there are secrets that have not been revealed. So everything gets thrown out of whack, that there are things that are being hidden from Christopher, and not just by anybody, but by his dad, the one who he trusts more than anybody else, which is a problem. Um, the eyes in Christopher have circles to dot the I's, which is an indication that his mom probably wrote the letters to him. I think Siobhan was the other option, and that one didn't make sense. So now we're starting to get into that trust issue even more. So now you see, well, hopefully you see why at the beginning of the book I was really pounding on this trust issue, and that trust equals love, and that good people don't lie, and the people that love you don't lie. Because I knew, and you now know too, that there were some big lies coming that were going to be revealed. Yeah. So, um, Christopher takes the one envelope, takes it into his room, but doesn't read it. Decides eventually after dinner that he can read it. It is after all his. So again, another evidence of Christopher making up his own rules. It's not. I mean, I guess it is his, but it's clearly not. It was in his dad's room. He took it. So again, he's making up his own rules for what he can do and what he cannot do in order to justify his actions. So he reads the letter because it's addressed to him, and then we get into the letter. She talks about getting a job, moving in with some guy named Roger, for not writing in a long time. She hopes that Christopher's not mad at her forever. And this is confusing to Christopher because his mother never did any of these things. Remember, she's dead. and she never lived in London, and she never had that job, and she never lived with a man named Roger. So we're figuring it out. But Christopher hasn't quite put all those things together yet. And then he notices the postmark, the little stamp on the envelope on the outside, that this is after his mother's death. So now you've clearly figured it out that this letter was written to Christopher after his mom supposedly had passed away. So Ed comes in. They just kind of talk about stuff. He has another mystery to solve. Sorry, I told you this wasn't going to be as smooth as the other ones. Christopher has another mystery to solve now, which he's sort of excited about because he doesn't want to jump to conclusions about what's going on. So now he's excited to figure out what's going on with these letters. And so he hides the letter and he decides to go watch TV, which again is not a normal response. We would be upset by this, but Christopher, at least immediately, isn't. His mother being alive just doesn't make much sense to him. And according to Occam's razor, the most logical response is the one that you should go to. And to him, his mom's dead, so there has to be some other response. His mom being alive doesn't even seem like it could really be a thing. So now he has another mystery to investigate, which he is excited about. And then we have this section where Christopher talks about supernatural phenomena, whether or not they can be explained, and how his Uncle Terry once saw a ghost and this, that, and the other. And Christopher argues that there are logical explanations for everything, and that there therefore must also be a logical explanation for the letters that he's just read. Clearly a dead woman can't write a letter, so there must be a logical explanation for that. The other element to this too is that in a certain way, Christopher is seeing a ghost, right? I mean, his mom is dead, and yet here she is writing letters to him. So there is a parallel there as well. I'm not suggesting that Christopher's mom is a ghost. This doesn't turn into a ghost story. But there is obviously some parallel there where Terry's talking about seeing ghosts, and Christopher is, in essence communicating with his dead mom. So there's definitely some ghostly-like things that are happening there. As he tends to do, we then go directly into this sort of fact-based thing. We talk about the mysteries of the frog pond and how everything can be explained by logical phenomenon, and specifically with him can be explained by math. But there are some unexplainable things in life that just take a turn, and Christopher doesn't. He can't always explain things, so even he will acknowledge that sometimes even the best logic fails you. So the next day at school, we're in chapter 157 by now. One of the boys at school has an accident in the bathroom. Christopher refuses to go to the bathroom, and he wets his pants, which doesn't really seem like too much of a thing until you stop and think that this is a fairly common response for children, especially when they're dealing with traumatic events. It's not unusual at all for kids to sort of lose their sanitariness when they're dealing with major life events. So even though Christopher doesn't acknowledge it himself, and he blames it on the happenings with this other kid, there is sort of a psychological aspect to that too, that maybe this is affecting Christopher more than he would let on. Christopher returns to the bedroom later, and he finds not just one, but 43 letters addressed to him. I asked you a question on the quiz. The number 43 itself doesn't have any magical power about the importance of the 43 letters, but the fact that there were 43 letters shows that this is a pretty big lie that Ed's been telling him. This isn't just one letter that he got and saved or kept from Christopher. This was something that happened over and over and over. So over the course of 2 years, he's gotten 43 letters, which amounts to about one every other week, every 3 weeks or so. And he's hidden every single one of those from Christopher, which is pretty significant. It's pretty significant. Yeah, So there we are with that. So now we get into the letters. We're reading, in my opinion, the one that's the most compelling. The second letter, in which Christopher's mom explains why she left. That she doesn't think she was a very good mother, especially a very good mother for Christopher, because she got upset so much more easily than Ed did. She felt that Ed was a better parent for Christopher than she was. She got easily upset by things. She couldn't handle it when he would shut down, especially when they were in the store, and things like that. So that caused tension between Ed and Judy, by the way, is Christopher's mom's name. Ed and Judy, just as Christopher alluded to earlier in the book when he said he thought that his parents might get divorced because they used to fight all the time, largely because of him. Well, as it turns out, yeah, that was pretty darn close to the truth. Arguments like this happened all the time. Judy ended up spending more time with Mr. Shears, Roger Shears, their neighbor, at first just because she could talk to him and confide in him, and she could escape the turmoil of what was going on at home. But, you know, things develop in ways that we don't always intend. And there were some romantic feelings that developed. It's interesting to note that Mr. Shears wanted her to leave, and she was willing to leave Ed, but she did have a difficult time leaving Christopher, and that was what kept her there for longer than she thought. Until Judy and Christopher get into an argument. He doesn't eat for days. They throw things. Christopher inadvertently breaks one of Judy's toes. Judy and Ed get into another huge fight. And she sees Ed taking care of Christopher while she's incapacitated and realizes that they are doing just fine without her and that they actually don't need her much at all, which is feeding into her inadequacy as a mother and what really compels her to feel like it's okay to leave because Christopher may actually be better off with just Ed. Whether or not you believe that's true is a completely different thing, but she certainly did. So Mr. Shears asks her, Roger Shears asks her to come to London, and she decides that it would be better if she just went. She was going to explain this to Christopher, but she can't because Ed forbids it. She didn't want to hurt him, and so another fight might have been more hurt. You know, it's a difficult situation, and Ed didn't let her say goodbye. And so now she's gone and not escaped, but apart from the situation, and then is feeling some regret about that. Obviously, she points out in her next letters that she is trying to stay connected with him by sending him the letters, by trying to stay up with him, hoping that she'll hear back from him someday, really being diligent in writing, even though she hasn't heard anything back yet. And that's sort of where we are. The fourth letter is kind of interesting. She talks about getting her teeth pulled, which again is one of those things which seems not that big of a deal. But if you step back and look at it, she goes to the dentist and she gets 2 teeth pulled. And if you step back and look at the metaphor for that, she's having 2 things that were creating pain for her removed from her body, removed from her life, which is ironic for me, considering my appendix. But she has these 2 things removed from her body, from her life, that were causing her problems. What other 2 things in her life were causing her problems? Hope one of you just said Ed and Christopher. And she had them removed from her life as well. And as she says in the book, Christopher had to be put to sleep when he had his teeth pulled, but she just had a local anesthetic, and it hurt her later. So if you look at the tooth pulling more as a metaphor for removing difficult things from her life, it seems to suggest that while it was something that she felt like she needed to do, she does acknowledge that it did end up hurting her down the road. So Christopher has now figured this out. He didn't really react to much of anything, but now that he's read all of this stuff, he's now figured out what's going on, and it absolutely overwhelms him in more ways than we have seen from him before. This isn't groaning. This isn't putting his face in the cool grass. He absolutely gets overwhelmed. He starts to feel sick. He gets dizzy. He curls up and lays down for an untold amount of time. All we know is that when he sort of comes to again, it's dark out. He's thrown up all over the bed. And every time, this is a beautiful, heartbreaking image, that every time his dad calls out his name, Christopher sees in front of him his mother's handwriting with the circles over the eyes, which is kind of heartbreaking. So now we see when Ed is calling out Christopher's name, he sees Judy's writing of it, and so both of the people that have betrayed him are now sort of coming together in his mind. So Ed comes into the room, and obviously he knows what's gone on. He knows what's gone on by then. And just imagine, if you will, for a second, exactly what that would feel like if you were him. You have this secret that you've kept for so long, and he did keep it for a good reason. He did a terrible thing and did a terrible job of taking care of his son, but that was his motivation. He was angry at Judy, and so he did want to get back at her and separate her from Christopher's life. Yes, that was a part of it, but he was also trying to protect Christopher and thought a clean break in which she just didn't exist anymore would be easier for him to process. So now he has to deal with all of this. Everything in Christopher's world falls apart. Ed can now touch him, which he was not allowed to do before. So Christopher's rules are starting to fall apart as well. Christopher can, or I should say, Ed can touch Christopher in this sort of comatose state, and it doesn't upset him. Ed loses it, begins to cry, explaining the situation, etc., etc., etc. And now, beyond just touching him, he can now take Christopher's clothes off, he can lead him into the bath, and there's no protest from Christopher whatsoever. So things that you would think would have become totally unacceptable to Christopher are now all of a sudden fine. Not just the touching, but the intimacy and the taking the clothes off and bathing him, that physical touch too, are all fine. So Christopher in this moment has really lost a bit of his identity. A hugely important and emotional part of this story. And if and when you do come to see the play, once school lets out, the way that it's rendered on stage is absolutely beautiful. Yeah, so that's where we are at the end of a pivotal and super, 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 super important chapter. As Christopher tends to do, he follows up a really important chapter with a pretty functional one, in which he tells this anecdote about the teacher when he first started at his school, Julie, and how she had this experiment where she had a tube with Smarties in it. She uncapped the tube, and there was actually a pencil inside. And she asked Christopher what did she think his mother would think was in the tube, and Christopher said that she would think that there was a pencil. And he gave this answer because he didn't really get that other people had their own minds, had independent minds. Once he understood something to be some way, he thought that everyone would understand something to be that way. He has a difficulty understanding how people would behave in a way that was different from him and from the way that he saw the world. So when he encounters something like this, in which he doesn't agree and doesn't understand why people are making the decisions that they do, he has a little bit of trouble processing that information. Yes. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. People's brains are like computers, because I want to get to, like I said, this one isn't going to be as long because I don't have it in me. But I do want to get to the end. Chapter 167. Ed's giving Christopher his bath. He tries to give Christopher some food. Christopher still doesn't speak. Christopher does some math to calm himself down. Excuse me. Which again is another coping mechanism. It might seem a little odd to you, but it's not that much different from counting sheep to go to sleep or something like that. Just some sort of persistent, consistent pattern to calm your mind down and keep it from thinking about other things. Christopher's still not talking when Ed comes back, and Ed tells him that he hasn't always told him the truth all the time, and that he's going to tell the truth in the future, all of the truth, 100% of the truth, because now he knows that lying is going to hurt more in the long run than the truth does, because he now sees how much pain this has caused his son. As difficult as it would have been at the time, that pain really would have been localized to Judy. He would have been upset with her, but not with his dad. And now, because of Ed's actions, he's broken both of those relationships. So he swears that he's going to be completely honest with him now and telling him the truth about everything. And in very short order, you get the answers to the answer to another huge question, and that is who killed Wellington. And Ed admits that it was him. That he's going to tell him this story to prove to him how honest he can be, and he's going to admit to him that he is the one who killed Wellington. That Mrs. Shears helped a lot after everything went down with the affair and Judy and Roger leaving, and Mr. Shears was around a lot to help sort of pick up the pieces. Ed thought things were going in a slightly more advanced direction than apparently they were. He thought that they might move in together, but that clearly wasn't the case. And then he sort of transfers some of that anger into some inappropriate places, which is a thing that we can do. Ed exposed himself. He had just gotten hurt by Judy, and so he opens himself up and he makes himself vulnerable to this other person with Mrs. Shears, and needing love and showing that he needed love, and then being rejected by that was really, really difficult for him. And so in being convinced that she cared about Wellington more than she did about Ed and Christopher, that was what pushed Ed over the edge. He justifies it and says that he got kicked out of the house. Wellington was there. Ed was very angry, and Ed imagined that Wellington might attack him, so he killed the dog. So he sort of builds this self-defense thing, but that doesn't really feel genuine. It certainly feels like a violent act, an act of aggression, and not an act of self-defense. So I'm not sure how much I buy that particular story. Christopher now is a little bit more engaged and is scared. He's scared of what his dad is telling him. So in another absolutely heartbreaking piece, especially if you're a parent, Ed reaches out to do the fingers thing with him. Remember their version of a hug in which they put their fingers out and the other one will touch fingertips with the other one. So he tells him the story, and Ed holds out his hand to do the fingertips thing, and Christopher pushes him off the bed, which is obviously a pretty sound rejection of that hug, if you will, which as a parent would be absolutely crushing, and is an indication of how big this is. Ed, well, let me back up. Christopher values truth. People who love you tell you the truth, take care of you, look out for you when you're in trouble. And now Ed has violated all of those things. Not only did he lie about his mom, he killed Wellington, all of this sort of stuff, and Christopher just doesn't know what to do with it anymore. All of these lies, all of these violations can only mean that Ed doesn't love Christopher. His dad is a murderer, and to Christopher, nothing else beyond that matters. He's a liar. He's a murderer. He can't be trusted. And in Christopher's logic, that means that he and Ed are done. So he decides that he's got to go. So he waits a few hours, and then he sneaks downstairs with his trusty Swiss Army knife, which again is a symbol of protection that isn't really there, right? What's he really going to do with this Swiss Army knife? It's this tiny little thing, but in his mind, it's one of the things that's going to be that's going to protect him. That's going to protect him. So he sneaks out with his Swiss Army knife. He brings Toby with him. Now, in Christopher's world, really one of the only things that can be relied upon, the only creatures, the only member of his family that really can be trusted in the amount of love that he has for him. He brings Toby with him because he doesn't want Toby to be left with his dad. His dad, someone who we now know will kill animals out of violence and out of anger. And so he brings Toby with him, which is actually kind of a really sweet gesture. And then he doesn't know what to do. He's stuck. So he has this motivation to get out, but he doesn't, at least right now, have the capacity to think anywhere beyond, his little block in the neighborhood of where he lives. So he just kind of hides behind the shed and wonders what he's going to do next, because at this point he really genuinely doesn't know. So if I am correct, that is where you guys ended chapter 167, which was a nice little break where we have this spot with Christopher trying to find out what to do. So now all of our questions have changed. We don't have questions about the affair anymore. We know what happened there. Christopher's mom was having an affair with Roger. They left. She is not dead. She lives in London with Roger. Christopher's dad thought he was in some sort of relationship with Mrs. Shears, probably was to a certain extent, but it wasn't exactly what he thought it was. It was Ed that killed Wellington. So all of our questions from the first part of the book really have been answered, and in a lot of ways the book kind of restarts itself now. So the question is, what happens next? What does Christopher do? Where does he go? What's his next step? So to the extent that you can, and I know I'm not there, and I apologize, even though it's not exactly in my control that I'm not there. If you have the wherewithal, discuss amongst yourselves what happens. Like what is the next thing? Christopher is hiding behind the shed. What does he do next? What are your predictions for what you think is going to happen next? And as you're discussing it, keep in mind who we're talking about here. This is not anybody. This is Christopher, and Christopher lives by a certain set of rules and a certain set of limitations that he places on himself and that are placed on him because of his condition. So that might affect some of the things that would be available to him that may or may not be available to other people. So where does it go from here? That's my question for you. And if you guys have some ideas you want to discuss amongst yourselves, by all means, I would encourage you to do that. Once you get done, you guys are going to be reading through chapter 193, okay? Through chapter 193, and that ends on page 158. Chapter 193 ends on page 158, okay? So, yeah, that's where we are. Hopefully I'll be back next time you guys meet. I don't know. I'm supposed to be out all this week recovering, but I should be back on Monday of next week. On a personal note, I know through other teachers, a lot of you have asked about me and sent good wishes, and this year has been a tough one for me. I usually don't miss a lot of school, and being gone a week for my dad unexpectedly earlier in this year, and then this happening now has been a lot to deal with in 1 year. But you guys have been great, and you sending your support through the teachers and that sort of stuff has really meant a lot to me. So thank you for that. The best medicine you can give me is keep reading the book, keep enjoying it, keep asking questions, keep trying to unravel what it is that's going on, and that'll be that. I'll see you guys when I get back. Bye.